What's up, guys? I hope you're having a wonderful week this week. I know I am because I was commissioned to paint some mountains, and mountains are one of my favorite landscapes to paint. So I thought, since I'm painting a commission of mountains, these mountains are in Chile, by the way, I would give you guys some tips on how you can paint mountains yourself. So getting started, I'm starting this the way I start all of my landscape paintings, just by sketching out the concept very quickly. This is just an 8" by 8" canvas, so I didn't do the grid pattern. I just eyeballed where everything was going to go. Since it's a small piece, I just put a little cross in the center there, so I knew where the center of my canvas was to get my proportions accurate with where each mountain peak would be spaced on the canvas. Now I'm working from a reference photograph for these mountains. I am not sitting outside looking at these beautiful mountains while I paint them, unfortunately. So when you are referencing a photo, you can put a cross in the center of your photo as well, so you know where all of your 4 quadrants would be on your painting, just by keep glancing at your photo and then your painting to make sure everything's matching up. Once I had the mountains sketched out, I started painting that sky. When you're painting the sky, it generally is more blue and saturated and a little bit darker in value than it is closer to the earth. So I started out with my phthalo blue, my white, a little bit of phthalo green mixed in there, and I kept adding more white and blending it down until I reached that mountain farthest in the background. Now some tips for painting the actual mountains. When you're looking at a range of mountains, the mountains that are farthest away from you are going to be different than the mountains closest to you. When you're looking at a range, the mountains farthest away from you are going to be lighter because they're very far away from you, and all the little particles of light and dust in the air have made them less clear than those mountains that are right in front of you. So that's something that you have to paint. You can't paint them all the same shade and value of color, or you're not going to be able to tell that those mountains in the distance are way farther out there. Another thing you have to think about when you're painting your mountains is that your vision gets a little bit fuzzy when you're looking really far out. You need to squint to be able to see the outer edges of that mountain that's the farthest away from you. So when you're painting that, you don't want to paint a solid line for the edge of your mountain. You want to have that line a little fuzzy, because the way you would see it in real life, it would be fuzzy when it's really, really far away from you. The mountain that's the closest to you is going to have more color. It's going to be darker and have more contrast in general, depending on where your sunlight is. And it's going to have very sharp edges. You're going to be able to see almost every little branch on the trees on the peak of that mountain. Or if it's a rocky mountain, you're going to see the individual rock crevices at the top of that mountain. So using those strategies, you can paint your mountains like I'm painting my mountains. Something else you might be beginning to notice in this painting is that the base of each mountain is lighter in value than the peak of each mountain. The peak is a little bit darker than the base, and that's partially because we have some fog and some low clouds that are making it a little fuzzy and brighter down at the base of the mountains. And it's also just the way we perceive mountains. We see the peak of them a little bit darker than we see the base. So when you're painting mountains, make sure you're painting adding a little bit more white or a little bit more of a lighter value color at the base of the mountain, and then blending it up into the color that you have at the peak of the mountain. Now you can see I'm applying what I mentioned before. This mountain is much closer to me. This is that last peak you see before this ledge in the foreground and the bottom part of the painting. So this mountain is going to be darker, it's going to have more contrast, and it's going to have more color. So we can actually see some of the green growing on this mountain, some of the vegetation, and we have dark blue shadows where those parts of the mountain are in shadow from the sun. And I also added some more foggy, low-lying clouds in front of this mountain that are just kind of reaching right into all those little crevices of the mountain. And I just blended those right into my blues and my greens in the mountain, so we had a nice fuzzy line for the fog. Here we have a flat, low-lying area as we're still moving closer towards us. This ledge in the foreground that hasn't been painted yet is much higher, so we have we're standing on top of a mountain looking out at these mountains. So what I'm painting there, that flat, low-lying area, is a much lower elevation from where we are right now. Now moving on to the rocks that are peeking out of the snow on the mountain we are situated on right here. To mix the color for the snow, I didn't want to use pure white because there are some highlights on the snow, and those highlights are going to be the brightest part of the snow, and the brightest color I have is pure white. So I blended in some ultramarine blue, and I blended in some alizarin crimson and a hint of black, just to get a color that can be perceived as white but is not pure white for the snow. For these rocks, I mixed burnt umber, a little bit of black, a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of cadmium red medium, a little bit of alizarin crimson, just to get like a purple brown shade, very dark. I want to have the most contrast between light and dark in this foreground right here. That's what's gonna make this little peak that we're standing on believable. And I am using oil paint for this mountain landscape painting, so I let the paint dry overnight. It wasn't completely dry, but it was dry enough to where I could still blend where I wanted to, or throw new paint on top of old paint without it blending when I didn't want it to blend. That's the trick. So here I'm just doing my finishing touches for the painting. I'm further boosting the contrast between light and dark in the foreground, adding shadows on those rocks, and adding little subtle highlights on the rocks where the sun is bouncing off of them a little bit, adding some deeper crevices in the snow where the wind has blown the snow on this mountain, using a little bit of a purple gray color. And I added my pure white for the highlights where the sun is just reflecting right off that snow in the foreground. Next, I went back into the mountains, touched up the borders a bit, touched up the fog a bit, and I touched up the highlights and the shaping of the mountain that's closest to us, because even though the foreground is what we first look at because it's bright and has that contrast, it then draws our eye back to that mountain right behind it, that first peak we see with the green and the blue. So I want to make that as believable as possible by giving it just the amount of detail and color and contrast, and then our eye is carried farther and farther back until we see that volcano, which is the farthest back from us in the center of the painting. This was a great picture to reference for a painting, and I really enjoyed making this one. I hope you guys learned some good tips for painting your own mountains. And thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Hit that subscribe button and you can check out my videos every Thursday